All right, thanks everybody. Tonight I'm going to be talking to you about birding the grasslands from an ecologist's perspective, and in a moment I will tell you what an ecologist is for those of you who don't know. But I work for BirdLife South Africa. I'm very, very lucky to be a part of an incredible team of ornithologists and scientists and conservationists. And just to tell you a little bit about my journey to BirdLife, I've been an avid birder pretty much my whole life. Sadly, the earliest photo I have of me birding is a feral pigeon down in the company gardens in Cape Town, but I was told I could make bird calls before I could talk. Crested barbet was apparently a favorite. So I'm very lucky to have always admired birds and found a way to build a career working with birds. And I'm very grateful to have my spot at BirdLife South Africa in the landscape conservation program. Now, the grasslands have always been a very special biome to me. I grew up in the east of Johannesburg, so the grasslands are always the closest area for me to go and bird. And one of my more recent milestones in February last year was a black-rumped button quail, which I was lucky enough to spot at Ngula Nature Reserve. I'm not sure if any of you have had the privilege of birding at Ngula yet. If you haven't, as soon as lockdown is done, put it on your hit list and get out to Ngula. It is one of the most amazing grassland reserves I've ever birded in, and definitely well worth a visit. And hopefully at some point, I believe Karina's coming to chat to you guys next month about Ngula. So I'm sure she'll share all of the marvelous wonders of Ngula Nature Reserve with you. Now, what exactly is an ecologist? So we are scientists who survey ecosystems, and we try and assess the diversity and abundance of the organisms within that. So it's really the big picture thinker scientists. We like to look at an entire ecosystem and understand all of the animals and organisms and vegetation within that system and how they all start to interact with each other. So if you think of a wetland, that wetland can support a multitude of animals and plants, and a lot of those animals and plants are specifically designed to live within that wetland. They're adapted to wet environments, then they wouldn't be able to live in, say, a desert. So understanding these unique traits and how they all fit together is really what an ecologist's job is all about. Now, the fantastic thing about birds is that birds are wonderful environmental indicators. We know here in South Africa, we have approximately 850 odd bird species that are regularly seen. And across the world, there are over 10,000 different bird species. And what's incredible about birds is just the way that they've been able to adapt to all the different biomes and habitats that we find, from the frozen Antarctic right out to the hottest, driest deserts of the Namib. And of course, in South Africa, we have these amazing penguins, bee eaters, painted snipes. All of these birds have adapted to their unique niche, and being able to understand how they track that niche and fit into those different environments allows us to take the temperature or the barometer of what's going on in our world. So we can use these amazing birds to really figure out what's going on with South Africa and the world in general. Now, I'm going to give you a quick Ecology 101 on South Africa, so bear with me here. We'll get into the fun bird pictures in a little bit. South Africa is an amazing place because we have this incredible topography. So when we talk about topography, we're really talking about mountains and valleys. So understanding how all of these fit together is really key to getting a handle on South Africa's ecology as a country. Now, at the bottom of Africa, we have the wonderful escarpment, and this really has a massive influence on the vegetation that we find, as well as the different animals that live in these high altitude mountain zones that are largely formed by the Drakensberg escarpment and the Cape Fold Mountains down to the south. And then, of course, we've got that vast expanding dry highveld at the top of the escarpment, and then our lowland coastal areas, which hold another multitude of species. And this topography has really led to some incredible diversity within our biomes. Now, when we talk about biomes, we're talking about the general vegetation unit within the country. So if we talk about a grassland, that means that that area is predominantly dominated by your grass species, versus a savanna, which has a nice mix of grasses and trees. And then, of course, moving into the unique fynbos, which is made up of wonderful proteas and restioid species. So we use these biomes to really quantify South Africa into these broad vegetation units. Now, that escarpment belt that you can see running along there captures a lot of our grassland diversity, and that's really important, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit of time. Now, just to look at the currents that influence South Africa and how they react with that escarpment, We've got the warm Agulhas current coming down the eastern side of South Africa from the equatorial zone where it's warm. That warm water pushes against the escarpment and of course creates quite a nice wet environment for that northern Zululand, coastal Zululand region. The water also then doesn't necessarily make it over that escarpment, which is why we see the more arid high-veld regions across the top of the escarpment and into the more arid center of the country. We have the cool Benguela current flowing up the western side, so that's coming up from the Antarctic, and that cold water creates a mist effect, which is why we have the succulent Karoo up our west coast. So it's really important to understand that it's not just the continent itself, but these big ocean currents are really affecting what happens to the vegetation on the ground. So with those currents interacting, we see this amazing precipitation gradient where we've got a much drier western part of the country versus our much wetter eastern part of the country. And this has led to some interesting dynamics within our grassland biome. Now, in the grassland biome, which is that big green patch in the center of South Africa, we can break this up into 74 different subgroups of grasslands. Now, we're not going to get that technical because this is not a botany lecture. But if we break this into a slightly more digestible subgroup, we've got these bioregions. And the four that we're really going to focus on tonight are the Drakensberg grassveld region, which is that big purple zone in the middle that makes up a lot of Lesotho. And that's really your high altitude grasslands. Any of you that have been able to get to the top of Sani Pass may have enjoyed some of these really high altitude grassland spaces. We're also going to look at that more sort of pale blue area, the Mesic high-veld grassland region. We have your more arid, dry high-veld grassland region to the west, and then of course on the eastern side, that's sub-escarpment grassland. So that's all the grasslands that are sort of below that very high, steep escarpment that runs through the eastern part of our country. And what's really incredible about this grassland biome is that it holds 52 of our 113 IBAs, and that supports approximately 350 of our 850 bird species within the grassland biome. There are also 15 endemic mammals that call the grassland biome home, and around 3,500 plant species. And this is just a small sample of some of the incredible plants that you can find within the grassland biome. Lots of really interesting proteas, the agapanthus, the pineapple flowers, and of course those beautiful candelabras that you get in the eastern Mesic grasslands. If you go in summertime, you are in for a real treat. There are a range of different orchid species. And if you ever have a chance to go out with someone like Jeff Lockwood or Franz Kricher, who lives out in Delstrom, they will blow your minds with the incredible grassland flower diversity that you can find. As I mentioned, there are some incredible mammals. Probably the most famous grassland mammal is the oribi, which is that antelope in the bottom center of your screen. And they are grassland adapted specialist antelope, and unfortunately very threatened. We've seen massive declines in their numbers with large habitat loss throughout the grasslands, and they are hunted by people using hunting dogs for subsistence hunting as well. So unfortunately, our oribi numbers are not doing too well. But there are also some really interesting animals that live alongside these oribi. Mountain rhebok, which is that antelope on the center right, and of course spot-necked otter, which is the one you can see in the middle there. So some fun furry creatures to join your birding. But the reason that we're all here is of course the beautiful birds of our grasslands. And you will be pleased to know that there are 13 endemic birds to the grassland bioregion. So 13 endemic or near endemics. So what endemic means is that it is only found within that grassland bioregion. Near endemic means that at least 70% of that bird's total population is found within the grassland biome. And there are some amazing birds within this group. We think of our endemic larks, Rudd's lark, Botha's lark, the Drakensberg rock jumpers, which call the high altitude zones home, birds like your southern bald ibis, and we're going to go into a lot of these in a bit more detail later on in this talk. Now, if you see that little endemic sticker turn up on the screens, that means that this is one of our endemics that I've highlighted here during the talk. Now, I mentioned that there's 52 IBAs within the grassland. IBAs are important bird and biodiversity areas. You can see those dark green patches throughout that grassland region that I highlighted earlier. There really are some important sites that we have worked very hard to try and secure as BirdLife South Africa. And so I'm really pleased to see that a number of these sites have been brought into conservation, sort of conservation profile through the IBA program. And we're working very hard to make sure that they remain in good shape to support all of our birds. Now, if we have a look at grassland conservation in general, so approximately 30% of South Africa's landmass is covered by grasslands. So that's roughly a third of our country that these amazing grasslands cover. Within these grasslands, we find more than 50% of our strategic water source areas. Now, strategic water source area is really the areas where our major river systems that support much of South Africa's drinking water are hosted. So within our grassland biome, pretty much more than half of our water is coming from this biome. So it's really important that we secure all the areas where those water sources are found and make sure that they remain clean and unpolluted to continue supporting us going forward. And unfortunately, when it comes to conservation of our grasslands, we are lacking severely. Only 3% of our grassland biome is currently under any form of what we call formal conservation. So that's the likes of your national parks or provincial conservation areas or nature reserves. So we have a long way to go in terms of trying to protect this unique ecosystem. Now, in 2018, the South African government released the National Biodiversity Assessment. What this document does is it really gives us a reading on what's going on with our country's conservation and our biodiversity and what's happening across different ecosystems within South Africa. And unfortunately, our grasslands were highlighted as one of the most threatened ecosystems in South Africa. And this also links to the wetlands that are found within our grassland ecosystems as well. So it is very concerning. And if you have a look at the map on your screen, all the areas that are in dark red are indicating your rate of habitat loss between 1990 to 2014. So what this is really showing is that your really dark areas are experiencing extreme transformation. So that's when we take a habitat out of its natural condition and turn it into something else. This could be either a human settlement, a mine, an agricultural use. It's basically just removing that natural landscape from biodiversity and taking it into some kind of human use. So you can see within our grassland biome, there's been a lot of habitat loss, particularly within that northeastern corner. So it's hugely concerning for us as conservationists. In terms of our threats to grasslands, a lot of these are linked to anthropogenic threats. And 40% of our grassland biome has unfortunately been irrevocably transformed. So that means that it's going to pretty much be near impossible to bring those grasslands back. The city where a lot of us find ourselves sitting this evening, Johannesburg, was once a teeming grassland, and unfortunately, it is no longer a grassland and unlikely to ever return to that. So that's just a clear example of how we've lost some of our grassland habitat. 92% of our South African forestry industry is located within the grassland, and you can see in this photo in the background just what it looks like when our grasslands are turned into pine plantations. 40% of South Africa's mining takes place in the grassland biome, and we see a lot of agriculture. 44% of this is cattle, 32% of South Africa's sheep is carried out within the grasslands. Now, luckily, there is some opportunity for conservation within this land use type. We're working very hard with our landowners to try and make sure that we can farm sustainably and in a way that doesn't damage our grassland biodiversity. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later on. We also see 60% of our commercial crops and 50% of our subsistence crops grown within the grasslands. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to commercial crops, we think of our millie fields in the Free State. Those do not support a lot of biodiversity, so that has a huge impact on what's happening in our grassland biome. And of course, when we think of the grasslands and all the farms out in those grasslands, one can only start to imagine the loss that we're experiencing on many of those fence lines. And BirdLife's been working really hard to try and mitigate the impacts of fences on our birds. This was unfortunately a barn owl, which I found hanging from a fence a couple of years ago. Very, very sad. And you can see the likes of power lines and other linear infrastructure that also play an impact within those open landscapes. Most of the birds that live within our grasslands have never experienced things being in their way when they're flying across our grassland areas. So we come and put thin wires in their path, and unfortunately, they just don't stand a chance. So we have a lot of work to do on this front, but we are engaging partners like Eskom and the farming co-ops to try and find ways that we can make those fences a bit more bird friendly. Another big threat is mismanagement of grassland habitats. Now, unfortunately, it's one thing to have a piece of land in a natural condition, but if we don't manage that property correctly, this can have huge knock-on effects for biodiversity. You can see in some of these pictures the different land use management practices across fence lines. On the one hand, you've got areas where there's clearly been a lot of fire, so that removes a lot of your woody biomass, versus another site where we've had too much grazing, and that's caused erosion where the vegetation has been removed. So it's really a balancing act when it comes to managing the grasslands and making sure that we're keeping them in a pristine way. Now, some of the tools that we have are linked to these drivers of grasslands. And when I talk about ecological drivers, I'm talking about things like fire, frost, natural grazers, so your sort of indigenous herbivores, and of course our domestic livestock grazers. And all of these different elements can come together to have very certain impacts on our grasslands. So if we take fire, for example, this was in the Buckestrom area. They'd been burning in late October. You can see the blue cranes and the southern bald ibises have all moved in to come and gobble up some Kentucky fried locusts. Depending on when you burn, this can play into the intensity of your fires. So if we burn very hot fires late in the season when there's a lot of dry biomass, this can result in quite a scorched earth effect on your grassland. And it can have a huge impact on some of the vegetation that doesn't deal well with these very hot late season fires. Farmers who burn early on in the season, so when the grass is still a little bit wet, they will often have fires that are not as intense, and that'll leave a little bit more biomass around for things to potentially escape some of those fire impacts. And that can often result in other impacts and see other types of biodiversity moving into an area, unlike this scene where you've got these blue cranes moving in onto this completely scorched earth area. As I said, the frequency at which you burn is also important. So if you're burning every single year, that can have massive impacts on the types of grasses that you're able to grow within that land. And then, of course, the time since burns. So if you leave a long lag time between your burns, you will build up a lot of moribund grass, and that often isn't very good for things like your seed eaters because they need freshly growing grass to provide a lot of seed. Now, David Mapisa back in 2017 did an amazing study where he had a look at the impacts of burning on our birds. And he found some really interesting things. When he was looking at transects where there'd been quite intense burning, he found that there was an increase in birds like your Cape longclaw, the common quail, as well as African quailfinch. But when he had a look at areas that hadn't burned, he saw that birds like your red-capped lark and your cloud cisticola had moved in. So therein again, understanding how each of these respective species respond to fire is really important for us to be able to manage our landscapes and make sure that we are keeping a diversity of landscapes that allow all of these species to coexist. We want to try and avoid completely burning an entire property. We want to make sure that we have what we call block burns. And so that's very important from a management point of view when we think about fire. But there's also the impact of grazing. If we have only a few cows, how does that affect our grassland versus many cows? Obviously, when cows move in, if we have huge numbers of them, they can completely remove the biomass from an area, much the same as a firewood, obviously without the charring. And this can really influence birds like your botterslark. Now, botterslark is an interesting little bird. It's very, very restricted to that corner between Free State and Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. Unfortunately, we are seeing massive losses in botterslark numbers across South Africa. And when it comes to management, this bird is very partial to high fire and high grazing. They like very open, low biomass areas. And so some of you may have gone to Buckestrom and visited the Drakensberg communal grazing land, which is a pretty trashed piece of grassland, but we do find botterslark in that area. So they really do enjoy quite intensive burning and grazing regimes when it comes to finding botterslark. Your rudslark, on the other hand, is not a fan of too much fire. They do, however, enjoy winter grazing. So if farmers bring their cattle in to graze in an area during the winter, you will often find that rudslark then move in the springtime to breed. And rudslark is a highly specialized endemic lark to South Africa. So this bird and botterslark are found nowhere else in the world. The closest relative to rudslark is the libbenlark of Ethiopia. And unfortunately, libbenlark is pretty much on its way out. I think there's less than 10 individuals left in the world. And sadly, it looks like our red's lark are going to start heading the same way when we start adding the effects of climate change onto these high altitude grasslands. We're going to see a massive shrink of our high altitude grasslands as temperatures go up, and our red's lark are going to be even more confined to very, very high altitude grasslands. So they're just emphasizing the fact that we need to make sure that those sites that are climate refugia for our birds are managed in an appropriate way. Now, moving on to one of our other beautiful LBJ endemics, the yellow-breasted pipit is a bird that really tries to avoid fire and grazing. So these birds are looking for fairly intact pieces of grassland that haven't burnt and haven't been grazed. There's a fairly decent amount of grass biomass left for them to breed in. And you can see also having quite a restricted distribution, very much restricted to those high altitude grasslands. But they look for these little patches of 4B islands within these bigger grassland patches, and they'll build a little nest, cup nest on the ground. And often when you find one nest, there's a high likelihood that you'll find a whole range of different yellow-breasted pipits within that area. So please, if you ever do bird in these grasslands, tread very, very carefully. Try not to just go stomping your way through these areas, because there's a good chance that you won't even see the nests and you could trample those eggs. Now, BirdLife South Africa has been working quite hard to ensure that we understand what our birds need when it comes to management. And so we've developed a very broad bird-friendly burning and grazing best practice for grasslands guideline. And this is something that we use to engage a lot of our landowners in some of our grassland stewardship areas. Now, biodiversity stewardship is an amazing tool. It allows us to approach private landowners, particularly cattle farmers within the grassland biome. And we work with these individuals to make sure that they are managing their properties in a way that allows them to still gain some economic benefits for their own personal livelihoods, but also maintains those properties in a condition that supports our birds and biodiversity. And we've seen a lot of success with this model across some of our grassland regions. So in the grasslands at the moment, we have Dr. Carl Lloyd, who's just taken up his position in the Greater Larkenvlei Protected Environment. This is an area of 14,300 hectares, and Carl is going to be working, mainly focusing on the white-winged flufftail, but also helping those landowners in that area to manage their grasslands and wetlands properly. We've then got Karina Kutzer, who's been assisted by Ernst Retief. They're working through the Sneuberg Protected Environment, which is near Mammals, and the proposed Upper Wilge Protected Environment, which is the surrounding 24,000 odd hectares that border the Ngula Nature Reserve. And what we've really tried to do here is to build this buffer zone of properties adjacent to the Ngula Nature Reserve to help bolster some of those wide-ranging, amazing grassland birds like your Ludwig's Bustard and your Secretarybird that we know need more than 8,000 hectares to be able to survive. So we're having excellent success within those Eastern Free State grasslands, and I really hope that you'll enjoy Karina's talk next month on Ngula. Then we've got Steve McKean. He's based in KZN, and Steve's been doing a lot of amazing work through the KZN mist belt grasslands. So he's really trying to target blue swallow sites. Blue swallows obviously being a very niche grassland specialist, and unfortunately also another bird that is really starting to show some scary declines across South Africa. So we're very lucky to have these incredible field officers on the ground working day to day with our landowners and securing additional grassland sites beyond just that formal protected area network that I spoke to you about earlier. Now, in total, just to show you there, we've secured around just shy of 69,000 hectares of grassland habitat, and hopefully as we continue to build this network, we can increase that number. Now, when it comes to grassland birding, there are a few golden rules, and I'm going to share some of them with you now. Before you leave for your trip, you need to make sure that you know what your target birds are. You need to plan to try and see those targets, so understand where the bird is likely to be, make sure that you get yourself to the right area on time, and of course, think about what is the season that you are going after these birds. Our grasslands are an incredibly variable place, like much of South Africa. We have seasonal rainfall, so if you want to target your migrant species and your breeding birds, you need to make sure that you're getting there in the wet season. So anytime from late November through to March, you have a good chance of seeing our migrant species. There's high insect activity, And of course, our birds are going to be more active, singing and displaying, and in their breeding plumage. In the dry season, our birds are a lot quieter. Obviously, our migrants have all moved off, and there's a lot less insect activity. So that really influences how active the birds are. These are some of the summer migrants that you might encounter. We have a lot of amazing raptors that fly in, the steppe buzzard, amur falcon, lesser kestrel. Of course, the barn swallows that are probably one of our better known migrant species that come down from mainland Europe and Asia. And then, of course, a host of intra-African species like your lesser and greater striped swallows, sand martins, and banded martins. Once you get to your destination, the best advice I can give you when you're in the grasslands is time, patience, and perseverance. You're going to need to put a lot of time in to be able to find the birds that you're looking for. A lot of our grassland birds are very cryptic, and you need to give them time to get used to you being in their environment. And of course, you need to think about getting there before that sun creeps over the horizon. Our grasslands are best early in the morning as that dawn chorus takes off. So make sure that you've packed your coffee and your rusks and get there as that sun peeps over the hill. It's also good to think about things like ethics. We obviously don't encourage people trespassing and jumping over fences. I personally am not a huge fan of callback, but I understand that in some cases it's better to call a bird out of its habitat than to try and crash in there. So be cautious with your callback, and obviously if birds are breeding, try not to abuse your callback too much. And then, of course, habitat, which is something we're going to be talking about a little bit more. Think about the elevation and think about the microsite that affects your bird. Is it a bird that's likely to be in a drainage line, like a fan-tailed warbler, or would it be a bird that's more associated with your rocky slopes? And of course, once you've found your bird, think about the call that you're hearing, look at the details on it, and have a look at its behavior. A lot of our grassland birds have some really unique behaviors that can help you get a good ID quickly without having to look too much into the detail of the bird itself. But my most important rule for grassland birding is have fun. Grasslands are an incredible place to bird. They are nice and open, and you feel like you could just range forever in the grasslands. So get out there, have fun, and let's move into some of the amazing birds that you can find in these different habitats. So I mentioned earlier the 4 bioregions that we have, just to show you what some of them look like. And you'll see I've got a little very coarse graph at the bottom there. On the up and down axis, so your vertical axis, you've got altitude. So low down would be your green star for the green subescarpment grassland region. And of course, this is also a wetter region than most of our grasslands. Versus our more drier, high altitude, which is almost the polar opposite of our subescarpment grasslands, the Drakensberg grassveld bioregion can be found in that dry and high area. If we move on to the mesic highveld grassland bioregion, we can see we've got high altitude but relatively wet, mesic meaning wet. And then lastly, in the most arid regions, fairly low altitude, and of course the most arid of our 4 bioregions. So if we put this on a horizontal map transecting South Africa, you can see that we've got this awesome range of grasslands that we're going to touch on. And I just want to highlight the fact that despite the area being largely grassland based, grasslands are actually very much a matrix of habitats. And I'm not going to be touching on the wetlands, forests, and rivers tonight. I typically give this as a 4-hour course, and then we spend a lot more time dealing with some of these other habitats. But to save time tonight, I'm just going to show you what I mean when I talk about matrix of habitats. You can see those little pockets of forest, and down in the valleys, you'll get these amazing Channel Valley bottom wetlands. And species like your wattled crane or your white-winged flufftail, unfortunately, both of which are critically endangered in South Africa, these are the types of birds that you could expect to find within our grasslands, but very much in those wetland areas. And then, of course, our amazing forests that support the likes of your orange ground thrush and the endangered Cape parrot. So even though you might be birding in a grassland, you will have access to some other habitats within that grassland area. And I do encourage you to try and hit as many of those different habitats within this matrix if you're potentially doing a big day or trying to get your numbers up for the day. Now, if we have a look at some of our more generalist grassland species before we move into the more specialized ones, I think there cannot be a more generalist grassland bird than my personal favorite, the Secretarybird. These birds are associated with our open habitats in South Africa, and they really are a flagship species for our grasslands. We use them a lot when we're dealing with farmers. They have a great rapport with local people across South Africa, and they really are just a wonderfully charismatic bird. Now, last year, we were lucky enough to have them as Bird of the Year, and we set up a Bird Lasser challenge. And just to show you the amount of data that we were able to collect on our Secretarybird sightings, we had 802 different sightings, and you can see the vast majority of those were centered in that central grassland region. So really just showing the importance of this area for our Secretarybirds. Now, if we have a look at the francolins, what I love about the francolin group is that they're a great example of where habitat is really key. On the screen here, you can see we've got your Orange River francolin, which is very much sticking to that arid western grassland that I told you about. If we have a look at the grey-winged francolin, which extends a little bit further east into your slightly higher altitude areas, you can then start to find your red-winged francolin as you move down those higher altitude areas into the more sub-escarpment grasslands. And of course, finishing off with shellies, which is not necessarily a true grassland species. They tend to be more on your rocky slopes, but still very much just showcasing how it's really important to understand what you're looking for when you're trying to find these birds. If you go looking for Shelley's francolin in Bloemfontein, you're probably going to struggle. So it's very important that we understand exactly where these birds are likely to be found. Now, this is probably one of our more iconic birds, the sakabulabird or long-tailed widowbird. And this is how they display. They do a beautiful drop-down tail display in summertime. And they are found throughout our grassland biome. So not very picky, very much a generalist widowbird. They also are neighbored by the red-collared widowbirds. So red-collareds like it a little bit wetter and hotter than the long-tailed widowbirds, which tend to be more on the upper escarpment. Your red-collareds tend to be slightly to the east of that and don't mind being a little bit lower down. We've got the white-winged widowbird, which tends to occur through Limpopo and Mpumalanga and very much enjoying those high-veld grasslands. And then, of course, your fan-tailed widowbird, which is probably the bird that enjoys the hot, wet, low-altitude areas the most out of our 4 widowbirds that are on the screen here. So again, just showcasing that it's really important to know what kinds of habitats these birds are targeting. Now, something I wanted to show you here was also how important it is to understand your bird's geographic variations. So here you've got rufous-naped lark, and these are probably your quintessential grassland LBJs. You'll often find them calling from fence posts, and they have a wonderful whistling call. Now, what I've done here is I've got 3 calls to share with you, and these move across a longitudinal gradient. So we're starting off with Klaksdorp in the west, and this is what they sound like. If we move a little bit further, so that's an Ezembello. And of course, Eswatini. So you can hear very much the same kind of call, but slight differences depending on where in the country you are. So it's always good to try and familiarize yourself with the call from the area that you're going to go and visit if you want to try and pick these birds up. A lot of your grassland birds you're going to pick up by ear before you see them. So it's very important that you know the dialect that you're trying to find. Now, what I like to sort of showcase here is that the escarpment has a great way of breaking rules when it comes to trying to find birds. We have 2 grassland bioregions, but when it comes to our birds, the birds tend to be low escarpment or upper escarpment. So they don't always necessarily stick to our grassland bioregions per se. But what we're going to deal with here is the birds that you typically find lower down in the sub-escarpment grasslands. And we're going to start off with our southern bald ibis. So these are amazingly charismatic birds. They've got these beautiful red bald heads, and they are also one of our grassland endemic species. They breed on rocky ledges, And you'll see they're largely restricted to that eastern mesic and subescarpment grasslands. Our black-winged lapwing, beautiful subescarpment grasslands and sort of the plateaus of rolling hills, like the shorter grass, and a very charismatic dapper plover or lapwing with that nice black bib. And then we've got the white-bellied coron, which is very much a sought-after grassland species. They're quite elusive and difficult to see. You'll often hear them calling in the grasslands long before you ever get to see them. But this is a pair that is found in the little town of Drakensberg. And if anybody's birded out near Wakkerstroom, there's a good chance that you've seen these exact birds. Really beautiful with that white face mask and a slightly pink base to the bill. You can see the male is a little bit more colorful than the female, as is typical of most of our birds. And if we move to a slightly bigger version of the Bustard family, one of our amazing subescarpment grassland birds is the Denham's Bustard. You can see the male on the right-hand side there and the female on the left. And these guys are probably most famous for their incredible lecking behavior, where they puff out those amazing plumes on their chests and do incredible dances to try and lure in potential mates. So well worth keeping your eyes out when you're cruising through the grasslands for these guys. They typically are on their own or in a pair, but beautiful, beautiful birds and really worth keeping an eye out for when you're in those eastern grasslands. Another extremely charismatic bird when it comes to our eastern grasslands is the grey-crowned crane. Of the 3 crane species, these guys are typically found on the edges of wetlands, so they will breed in the wetland itself, but you'll typically find them foraging on those sloping hills just to the sides of the wetlands. And they're hard to miss with that beautiful black and white face and that wonderful crest of feathers on top of their heads. Really, really beautiful birds. And if you get the chance to watch them courting each other, they do a beautiful dance that is absolutely mesmerizing. Then on to a very difficult to find but absolutely fascinating little bird, the black rump button quail. As you can see from the SABAP data, not very well known. These birds are found all the way down to the coastal grasslands on the eastern side of South Africa. So those of you who visited a Matakulu Nature Reserve may have had a chance to connect with these birds. They also are found along the sort of subescarpment upper grasslands, and we really don't know that much about how these birds move around South Africa. They're pretty elusive and difficult to keep tabs on, and you'll often flush one in the grassland and that's it. You won't see another one again. So I was very, very fortunate to capture this guy cruising along, sorry, this female moving along the track at Ngula, and managed to snap a few photos before it ducked off to the right-hand side and was gone. Now, one of our iconic grassland migrants is the blue swallow. Unfortunately, they are critically endangered in South Africa, and there are only a handful of sites where we still find these birds. They come down to South Africa to breed, and then they move up into Central Africa to for our winter period when things are dry in the grasslands. Really stunning little birds. We're not 100% sure why we're seeing such massive declines in their numbers. It could be linked to pesticide. It could be linked just to massive habitat loss through the mist belt grasslands. But we hope not to see the blue swallow go extinct anytime soon. And we are working very hard to make sure that we do keep those sites pristine and managed well so that our remaining birds can hang in there and hopefully breed successfully every year. I spoke about understanding your microhabitats, and what I was referring to here is if you find yourself in a grassland, often our grasslands are these rolling hills, it's really important to understand that the birds you might find here on the sort of rank slopey drainage lines are going to be very different from the birds that you might find at the top of that hill. So when you're looking down at the lower rank areas, you might find things like your fan-tailed warbler, or your yellow bishops that like things to be a little bit wetter, versus your upper rocky slopes where you might encounter guys like the Cape rock thrush. So male at the top, female at the bottom, also endemic to South Africa, but beautiful birds, that nice grey head. you're unlikely to find the Cape rock thrush down in those rank grasslands. You'll typically find them up on the slope. So therein, just emphasizing once again how important it is to understand exactly the kinds of really small scale habitats that these birds are targeting. If we spend a bit of time on these rocky slopes, there are a number of really exciting birds that you might be able to encounter. The likes of a long-billed pipit, your mountain wheatear, and of course the familiar chat. And up in the top left there, you can see one of our endemic raptors, the jackal buzzard. I was lucky enough to catch this guy just outside of Ngula. They really are amazing raptors that cruise through the grasslands, nesting on the cliffs that are surrounding a lot of our mountainous regions, and well worth watching out for. You also find birds like the ground woodpecker, and I don't know if any of you can spot that ground woodpecker in the center of the screen there, but this is a slightly closer look. These are little family living wonderful woodpeckers. They are the biggest woodpecker in South Africa, and they nest in holes within those rocky mounds, and definitely one which worth watching out for. You'll sometimes hear their calls ringing out. They have their Afrikaans name is the spech, and that's the sound that their call is. So definitely keep your ears open when you're near those rocky slopes for these beautiful ground woodpeckers. Then on to another beautiful endemic of our grasslands, the buff-streaked chat. That's what the male looks like, absolutely gorgeous, dapper, with that black face and a beautiful buffy eyebrow. And his slightly less charismatic female. These birds tend to be fairly high living birds, so you won't find them too low down. They're definitely upper escarpment birds. And you'll often find eastern long-billed larks living alongside them. And I'm going to play you the call of the eastern long-billed lark. It's a beautiful long whistle and well worth keeping an ear out for. And you might find the African rock pipit. This is a beautiful bird, bit of an LBJ, quite drab, but once you get a little bit closer to them, they've got that nice yellow sheen to their wings and shoulder, and a little bit of a white eyebrow there. So keep an ear out for them. You'll hear their calls coming along the top of the mountains. And then, of course, we move on to our cisticolas. Now, there's a cisticola for every grassland habitat, and we're going to start off with our short upland grassland. Now, these are the ultimate LBJs, and I always like to tell people that if you can spend a little bit of time breaking down your cisticolas, they're actually not as difficult as everyone thinks they are. And Fancy Peacock did an amazing job of explaining cisticolas in his LBJs book, and I highly recommend spending some time reading that book if you are serious on getting on top of your cisticolas. So we'll start off with wing snapping. These guys are beautiful little birds, and you'll often hear their calls ringing out from high above your head, but you won't see them in the sky. And then we move on to the cloud cisticola. Cloud cisticolas are wonderful little birds. They're quite pale compared to some of our other cisticolas, and they have a bit of a three-part call. And then, of course, probably the most well-known of our grassland cisticolas, the zitting cisticola, with that very well-known zit call. So you can hear that very clear zit, which is where its name comes from. Now, if we move from our more open grassland, where you find all three of these birds, you will find the moist depressions that are in the sort of lower lying areas of our grasslands. And in this area, you'll find the zitting cisticola, but you'll also be able to find a slightly more specialized cisticola, the pale crown cisticola. And he has that very shrill call, which you need to listen very, very carefully for. Moving from there onto our more arid areas, in your western parts of the country, you're going to find the desert cisticola. This is our palest of the cisticolas. So you can see they're almost white in his plumage, and this is what he sounds like. It's a very high whistle. And then the biggest of our cisticolas, the croaking cisticola, which is a almost frog-like chirp. And then we move on to another one of our more common cisticolas, which is Levior. And I always like to associate this guy with the more wetter areas in our grasslands. And you can see that very dark streaking on his back is one of his more telltale signs that it is a Levian cisticola. And that chip chir is really what you're listening for when you're trying to find a Levian cisticola. So moving into our more high altitude grassland regions, this is the Drakensberg grassveld bioregion. And I'm going to really take you from the bottom of Sani Pass to the top of Sani Pass with some of these birds. So we're going to send up the mighty Drakensberg, and we're going to start off low down, where you really need to keep an eye out for these Leucocidia shrubs and trees. You can see the leaves there just below that bush blackcap or next to the Barrett's warbler. These two birds are your shrubby specialists, and you'll often find them associated with these birds, these shrubby drainage lines. Moving on to the sort of rolling plateaus along Sani, if you are very lucky, you might come across a short-tailed pipit, or on the slightly smaller shrubs, the Drakensberg prinia. And be careful not to confuse the Drakensberg prinia with Karoo prinia. When you get to the top of Sani Pass, where we find a lot more of our Karoo specialists, you will find Karoo prinia at the top there, and they have been known to hybridize. So keep an eye very, very close on the prinias that you encounter when moving up the likes of Sani Pass. From there, we move into the forests of proteas. And these amazing proteas are extremely vital in supporting some of our amazing nectarivores. So Gurney's sugarbird in the top middle there, endemic to South Africa, near endemic to South Africa. There is a small population in Zim, but a beautiful, beautiful sugarbird. And he's to his right is a malachite sunbird. And these red hot pokers that grow along Sani are also very important in supporting these nectar drinking birds. We've got our greater double-collared sunbird in the bottom right, and then your southern double-collared sunbird to the left. So a whole multitude of these nectar-drinking birds across Sani, and really beautiful little green gems. From there, we start moving up to slightly more rockier, scrubbier habitat. And here you might encounter the endemic sentinel rock thrush. So unlike the Cape rock thrush, you can see the sentinel's completely grey back, and the female there isn't as orange as your Cape rock thrush, but really pretty birds. And you might also encounter the small Cape bunting with that beautiful zebra marking on its face. Now we're really moving up into the more cliff-oriented habitats, and here this is the realm of the white-necked raven. So really thuggish, chunky birds that cruise along the wind currents that move along these cliffs. You might also be able to find some Cape vultures, but the bird that everybody is really here to see on these cliff lines is, of course, the bearded vulture. An amazing, amazing bone-eating scavenger, and very much restricted to these high altitude cliffs in the Drakensberg. Once you get to the top of Sani, there really are two targets that everybody's after. The first one being your Drakensberg siskin, very pretty little yellow bird. The females are slightly browner, and of course our Drakensberg rock jumper, both endemic to this region and very much high altitude species. You won't find these birds low down. You really need to get into those very chilly, very high altitude regions. And while you're up there, keep an eye out for another endemic mammal, Sloggett's ice rat, another high altitude endemic, and of course the Drakensberg crag lizards. So once you get to the top of Sani and you look out, this is what you're going to find. These beautiful montane, very short grassland plains. And a bird that you may be lucky enough to encounter between October to early April is the mountain pipit. And make sure not to confuse these with the more common African pipit. What you're looking for is that pink bill base, and of course buffy, not white outer tail feathers. And they have a slightly slower song than the more common African pipit. So from there, we're going to move on to our more high-veld region. So this is the area beyond the Drakensberg onto our well-known high-veld plateau. And you can see those rolling, dry, grassy plains. That this is really the landscape that we're going to be looking at. So this is what it looks like in the summertime. And you might be lucky enough to encounter birds like your eastern clapperlark. And this is a bird that really has a wonderful call. It does a little up in the sky and then does a long whistle. So really, really great bird to get close to. And you can see the beautiful mottling on its back there. A stunning bird considering just how brown it is. Another one of your more common LBJs is the pink-billed lark, not to be confused with Botha's lark. Our pink-billed lark has slightly darker facial markings and that very pink bill. And you can see both of these birds preferring that more arid, high-veld grassland region. One of the more charismatic of our lark species is going to be your spike-heeled lark. These are gregarious larks, so they live in little family groups. You can see the two of them catching some sun at Sekebosrand Nature Reserve there. And this is what they sound like. So great little call there. But the lark that everybody is really interested in getting onto when they come and visit these arid grasslands is, of course, the endemic melodious lark. Now, these birds are absolutely phenomenal. I was lucky enough to be out in the Vlakte grasslands just to the north, just to the east of Johannesburg earlier this year, and I had the privilege of watching these birds display, and they are phenomenal mimics. So I'm going to play you a call now, and you'll likely hear a few other birds' calls within that. This is all made by one single bird, and they've been known to do these display flights for up to 45 minutes in one go. A bird will fly up and just fly in a big circle doing these amazing display calls. So this is what they sound like. Let's just try to swallow in there. Really fantastic, guys, to go and watch. Some of your more common grassland birds in the arid landscapes are your ant-eating chats. These are another family living bird, so you'll find them in little groups of between 5 to 7 individuals. And they'll also be joined by the likes of capped wheat ears. Beautiful, dapper little birds, often seen sitting on the fence posts along the road. Not to be confused with the buff-streaked chat, which has a completely black face. These guys have a little bit of a white chin to them. And just a bit of fun interaction that I got to observe in Topography Nature Reserve a couple of years ago. Ant-eating chats and banded martins will often have quarrels over who gets to nest inside the multitude of aardvark holes that have been dug across these grasslands. And so here this banded martin was taking on the ant-eating chat, trying to lay claim to that nest hole. And I believe that the banded martin did eventually succeed and managed to chase off the ant-eating chat in this particular encounter. Another beautiful breeding endemic to our South African grasslands is the South African cliff swallow. These gorgeous little birds are not to be confused with our barn swallows. You'll see they have that lovely red rump, and they don't have the tail streamers that we associate with our barn swallows. Beautiful little jet fighters cruising along the grasslands, and you'll often find them nesting under small bridges that cross over the multitude of streams that are flowing through our grasslands. Another small LBJ, you'll see the arid lands tend to have a trend towards our browner birds. The black-throated canary, lovely little seed eater, and well worth catching up with if you get the chance. And then, of course, probably our most charismatic, iconic arid grassland bird, the northern black coran. You'll hear these guys early in the morning standing on top of termite mounds, laying claim to their territories with that screeching call. And that call really does carry over the grassland areas. And another coran species that is very much restricted to our arid grasslands is the blue coran. Once again, a bird that you're far more likely to hear than see, and this is what they sound like. Really incredible birds. And so just to wrap it up, I thought I'd share with you my personal top 6 grassland birding destinations. So some of the areas that I've spent a lot of time in and really love birding in their different grasslands, starting off with the Drakensberg IBA. So this is really your broader Delstrom area. Amazing mesic grasslands and well worth a visit. Then the Grasslands IBA, which is home to Vakkerstrom and Mammals. Segerbos Nature Reserve. If you have a day trip and you're in the south of Gauteng, always worth a visit. Lovely diversity of arid grassland habitats. Golden Gate National Park, another stunning national park to visit. And of course, Ngula Nature Reserve. And my final favorite is Sani Pass. You saw some of the photos there. Really just a wonderful selection of good grassland birding habitats to go and visit. If you haven't been to any of these yet, I strongly recommend going to see some of them. And with that, I'd just like to give a plug to our webinars. If some of you haven't heard about them yet, every Tuesday night at 7, we are doing conservation conversations. And you can register for these at our website, birdlife.org.za, BLSA conversations. So please go and check it out. If you enjoyed this format of talk, we have a whole host of other speakers lined up and some really interesting topics. And with that, I will say thank you and take any questions if anyone has any.